Well, thank you very much for coming here. I was the first Jewish Secretary of State, and of course I had a life as a member of a Jewish family that went through the Holocaust. So these were not experiences that one could separate from one's actions. And these are experiences, of course, of which I remain conscious. I thought the best way to conduct this discussion is for you to ask questions that concern you. I will give the best answers based on my recollections today. So I do not know every detail, but as you all know, it was a searing experience. And so many events, maybe most events, one remembers almost on a daily basis. So if I can help you reconstruct events, I'll do so to the best of my ability. But feel free, if you have a contrary view to anything I say, to state it. So who wants to start?
Well, we'll start with just a few remarks about the purpose of this interview for the record, you know, because it is recorded. Well, we all know that the Yom Kippur War is the most dramatic event in Israeli history. It is a very important event in the history of the Middle East, and to a certain extent also the world in general. And it is really a great opportunity for us to receive your views, not the details, your views, your perspectives about the main events before the war, during the war, and after the war, what we can learn from this war. So our questions will relate to these three periods, of course, and again, we thank you very much for sharing your experience and recollection with us.
Professor Kissinger, maybe we should, at the beginning, just go over some of the main events, and again, following this structure of before, during, and after. And we would like to start with the time before the war. And let's define it to make it easier, 69 to 73, or the ongoing discussions that you led in order to try and find a solution to the Israeli-Arab conflict. There were many of them, and I would like to ask about your meetings with Hafez Ismail, about the secret channel with Anwar Sadat. What sort of chance, how did you view that in real time, and what sort of chance did you give that it would really lead to reconciliation in the Middle East?
First of all, when you talk about the history of that period, it didn't necessarily, for the American side, segment itself into the same parts as for you. In its first term, Nixon did not want the peace negotiations moved into the White House. He put them under the direction of the Secretary of State. And he more or less kept them there until the beginning of his second term, which is when the contact with Hafez Ismail occurred. The White House as an institution had no negotiations with Arab leaders. They were mostly, almost exclusively conducted by the State Department on the various peace initiatives. Of course, the White House had to approve them and expressed views as they were being developed, but the negotiations were essentially conducted in terms of some of these ideas of a Suez Canal arrangement. When I got in touch with, it's really the other way around. They got in touch with us, and I indicated a willingness to receive them. Of course, fully discussed with Nixon. Our idea at the time was, this was early in '73, I believe. Our idea at the time was we would begin a dialogue, but we did not think it could really be effective until after the Israeli election, which was supposed to be at the end of that year. But we intended to do the preparatory work on the key issues, or on some of the key issues, and also to find out what the Egyptians had on their mind. So I saw him twice, once in America and another time in France, near Paris.
What impression did you come up with from your first meeting with him, which was the main meeting with Hafiz Ismail? Did you see enough meat to bite in order to start moving a political process, or was it too thin?
My main concern at that point was not to start a negotiation, but to make clear to them how we visualized a process, and how we visualized a solution short of an all-out solution that separated the problem into various parts. As I remember, he was only interested in an overall solution, which would have to be imposed on Israel. And so we just talked about the components, but they said afterwards it was clear to them that we were not going to move on this.
And when you delivered that offer or conditions or preterms to Golda Meir and other Israelis, how were you impressed with their comments and their reactions?
The Israelis?
The Israelis.
I did not do that. I did not do it. I was at those conversations were for my assessment to be made to Nixon. Once we moved into the actual operation, I would be charged with dealing also with Golda. I don't think Nixon was eager to do that at this point. Mm-hmm. So I was not involved in actual negotiations with Arabs and not involved in any governmental negotiations with Israeli. I knew many of the leaders, and I knew their views as the various plans developed, but I was not the principal that they were focused on.
But Golda comes to Washington immediately after your first round of talks with Hafiz Ismail, and it is on the table, and in general, not specifically about these talks, what was your impression of Golda's readiness to give Sadat what he wants, which is the Sinai, with security arrangements, etc. Did you see any development in her attitude toward reaching an agreement, or she stayed all the time in the same place?
It's first of all not the way we worked. Mm-hmm. So it's the wrong way to put it. I mean, we did not come to Golda and said, here is our precise idea. Mm-hmm. At that point, as I remember it, it's a long time ago, the basic agreement was that from now on the negotiations would be moved into the White House.
Yes.
And there was that Israel was not willing to go back to the 47 borders, and that this was unachievable. At that moment was a rather settled idea in our mind.
Did you felt in real time that if an arrangement is not reached now, following some things that Hafiz Ismail and maybe other Egyptian officials told you, there will be war? Was there a viable threat that Egypt, what cannot be achieved with negotiation, would try to achieve by force?
We in the White House were not, there was a difference of opinion which was sort of a global opinion, which was that there was only one way to make peace, and this was with an overall peace agreement immediately, or that was not our view. Our view was that this was probably not achievable, and that therefore we would prefer to move step by step, as we repeatedly made clear. That was not a secret. And as we said to the Egyptians.
In the balance between getting Egypt out of the Soviet camp and promoting the beginning of a peace process between Egypt and Israel, how did you balance these two goals? Did they complement each other, or did you see any contradictions?
We didn't look at things that way. We had a strategic concept. Mm-hmm. And I said in the first month of the Nixon administration, I said to some press person, an unwise comment, our plan is to expel the Soviet Union from Egypt. Mm-hmm. That was part of our overall concept. That was the guiding concept in dealing with the Soviet Union, and in a way with Egypt. We had a sort of a phrase which we sent to practically every Arab state when the 73 war broke, which is, you can make war with Soviet arms, but to make peace you need American diplomacy. And please keep that in mind. That's what we were working on before the war. So all these fine points of negotiation and of that was not the Nixon style or my style. We wound up there, but first we wanted to get it across that that was going to be our approach.
Dr. Kissinger, sorry for playing the game that historians do not like to play, counterfactual history. The Yom Kippur War, the October 1970 war, is the big trauma in the history of our nation. And a lot of people are saying, in retrospect, this is a war that could have been saved if Israel would react differently to the Egyptian proposals sent by Professor Kissinger. Do you agree with this claim?
Of course not. First of all, there was no specific proposal to agree to. What there was an idea of what the outcome should be. What would have happened if Israel had come to us and said they want the 47 border and they would like us to advocate the 47 border? That never happened. And in my opinion, couldn't have happened in the circumstance of the time. It couldn't have happened under Nasser. And now, in retrospect, one can draw great conclusions about Sadat. But it took a while before people realized the extent to which he was willing to go. So I don't believe the war could have been avoided except by Israeli acceptance of the Arab peace plan. And that didn't really exist.
Yes. You mentioned that your strategy was to prepare the ground for a bigger initiative after the Israeli elections. What was the concept of this initiative?
Well, you first of all have to understand that in the first Nixon administration, we were preoccupied with the Vietnam War. We had the opening to China. We had the détente with the Soviet Union. We had the East Pakistan uprising. So it's not that we were unemployed. And these were, and those were priorities. They had to be dealt with. It wasn't that we said Israel is less important. We said we cannot possibly get to this. In addition, it was our judgment that the overall plan would not either be accepted by Israel. I personally never approved of the concept. So insofar as my opinion mattered, it was known. But Nixon made the final decisions. But this was not an item that had the same priority.
Even in late 1973. Well, of course, he had other troubles.
By 1973, we were in the final stages of the Vietnam War. We were at the beginning of the trip to China. the trip to China actually only took place in February 1973. The trip to Moscow took place in May 1973. So the question you're putting is, if we had done something in between May and September 1973, could the war have been avoided? We obviously didn't think so, or we would have done it.
Yes.
And when getting close to the war, you're getting more and more signs that tension is in the build-up. Gromyko comes to Washington and says, we will wake up one day with war. You get reports from your intelligence that there are possible plans for war, and you are beginning to worry that maybe war is imminent.
But it's also true that in the weeks before, we asked Israel regularly, are there any signs of war? In fact, on my first weekend as Secretary of State, I went to the State Department to look at their intelligence reports, because they had not been circulated to me in that form when I was security advisor. And I asked the Israelis to give me an assessment of the deployments every other day for a 2-week period. So, but had we gotten it, we would certainly have made diplomatic moves. But there was no possibility, at least with the limits on our intelligence. Our IQs, to say now, in the summer of '73, we have to come up with an overall peace plan. We thought the opposite would be a good. We wanted to get a more detailed expression of Israel, and above all from Egypt. When the war broke out, we had not yet come to any definitive conclusion about Sadat.
We know that when war broke out, there were two surprises, actually. One, that the war started without any early warning, and the other, the Israeli defeats in the battlefield in the first few days of the war. And I read quite a lot about the administration, radio memoirs, of course, and other accounts, and the impression is that it took the administration time to understand that the expectations before the war...
After the war broke out?
Yes, after the war broke out, to realize that Israel's situation is really far worse than what anyone could have expected.
But it took Israel a little time.
It took Israel also,
understand it.
Well, you know that our Minister of Defense, Moshe Dayan, he spoke on the second day of the war in terms of war of the Third Temple and things like that. He in fact went to the other extreme. How were the Israeli reports about the war the main source of information for you to estimate the situation, or did you have your own sources, especially intelligence sources?
Well, if you people were engaged in war activities personally, you know that it never moves in such a clear line that there is a flood of information that comes in, out of which you have to sort what you make, on the basis of which you make your decision. And you have to break it down into categories. In the first days of the war, primary objective was to get an understanding of the situation and at a minimum stabilize it. So there was no time for great thinking at that point. And that's what we did. And we received a lot of wrong reports, including some that Israel had started the war.
Yes.
And we took the position from the beginning that Israel territory should be inviolate. And from the beginning, we're working on a UN resolution which would express that. So the political objectives of the various parties only crystallized as the situation evolved, including the Israeli thinking.
When, just before the war, how, and in any general, how much importance did you attribute to make sure that the Israelis are not the first one to open fire, like in the Six-Day War?
On the national level, on my level, we thought that was understood. And I don't think we made a specific request. But on the working level, I don't doubt that that thought was often expressed.
Meaning the U.S. asked Israel, please do not launch a preemptive strike.
I don't think it ever got to that point.
If I may, in 1968, in early 1968, before the Nixon administration enters into office, the Israeli chief of staff speaks already in terms of we will not be able to shoot the first shot in the next war. So it was an understanding in Israel, even without American pressures or anything.
But you know,
this is
it
the
didn't
situation.
come up, if we are realistic, it didn't come up that way.
No.
In terms of a decision. You were surprised.
Yes.
You didn't expect it. You were never in a position to ask us whether you could do a meaningful first strike. But you could say yes, maybe in the last hours. Yes. You couldn't have organized a meaningful strike. Or maybe you could have. It never came to us.
Yeah, when it came to you, it was after the Israeli decision was made already not to strike the first strike. So we were not.
There were stories and rumors and some interviews according to which United States has seen Israeli preparation to launch a nuclear strike, or at least taking the surface-to-surface long-range missiles from the silos and preparing them, and do that for your satellites and the Russian satellites to see and understand that Israel grasps the situation as severe. What was the influence of that move from Israel on you?
I don't think that's correct. That information, if it existed, never came to me. And we never acted on it one way or the other.
So the story is as if Simcha Dinitz has said something in a meeting with
Simcha
you.
Dinitz wasn't even in America at the time. He was in Israel.
Yeah.
And there was no senior Israeli there whose words would have had the weight of such a threat. But that's not what... it could be that such information was around. It'd be amazing if it were not brought to me. Yeah. And at that moment, Nixon was in Florida, and operationally, I was conducting business on that day.
Yeah. I refer to that meeting that you had with Dinitz. The transcript says that you were left alone for just between you, and there's no...
But it was
the third day of the
but
war.
then, or maybe the third day of the war.
Yeah, when he came, and part of the meeting is not transcribed.
That's possible. That happened occasionally. That's probably true. There was not a conversation in which Israel threatened the use of nuclear weapons. And it would have been unwise to do, because the possession of nuclear weapons was not recognized formally.
But was it a consideration was it a consideration in the administration that Israel might be pushed to a corner where it will have no other choice but to threaten, not use, but threaten? It
didn't affect any decision that was made.
You took a chaotic situation at the beginning of the war.
A what?
A chaotic, a mess, surprising situation. And I don't know how you managed to do it, but you came up with an outcome that allowed the beginning of the most promising diplomatic process between Israel and Egypt, and later Israel and Syria. Can you elaborate a little bit about what went through your mind when you did it? Because in a way it is a miracle. How did you do it?
Well, first we didn't improvise it when the war started. We, in our internal discussions, which meant in effect Nixon and myself, with a few others occasionally, we had always wanted or planned that if a war broke out, that the two ways a negotiation could come about. One through American pressure in an American initiative, and the other with American pressure as a result of a war. And we had intended to do it at the beginning of 74, end of 73, and to start building up to it in 73. And then when the war broke out, remember these deadlines are very short. It was really breaking out at the moment that we had planned for the peace offensive anyway. What we didn't know was that there would be a partner that was willing to do a peace step-by-step approach. So that enabled us to move much faster than one could have anticipated, and with more Israeli cooperation.
And it needed the war to create more Israeli cooperation.
I don't say that necessarily. We had many conversations with Rabin and Dayan and as friends. They didn't have to be forced to do this.
Not forced. I'm just saying that maybe the existence, the trauma of the war. But I wanted to ask Dr. קיסינג'ר about the airlift that a lot of people in Israel thank you for making and establishing. How was it? How hard was it to convince President Nixon to go for the airlift?
To what do you mean by that?
To order U.S. military forces to support Israel with the military airlift that will help Israel regroup and reinforce.
But that didn't come up in that manner. That came up in the form of Israeli requests for military equipment, which started on the first day, and which we in the White House supported, starting the first day. At that time, to be picked up, the equipment to be picked up by Israeli commercial planes that were adapted to this. That started Sunday evening, and was approved by the White House. It was carried out reluctantly by some others. So that was the first phase of the resupply. The next phase started when the Israelis informed us that of the losses in the Sinai battle. Up to that point, we thought the battle was moving in favor of Israel, and that the next news would be an Arab collapse. And so that news was brought to us by tenants who had flown back on a Tuesday morning. And that was the day that Nixon had to arrange the resignation of his vice president. So he was not personally available. So I told Dinitz we would answer him by that evening. And we told him that evening that rather than talk now about specific supplies, we promised to replace all equipment that was lost in the war, and so that therefore Israel could conduct its operations without having to keep a reserve for post-war contingencies. So that's what we promised them that night. And then the next day started the question how to deliver this equipment. Which the military did not want to use American military airlift. They wanted to mobilize the civilian reserve fleet. And one had to clear airports in the Azores. So that debate went on. But while that debate was going on, there was a number of airplanes and other equipment that was already being delivered every day. I think 3 F-4s were delivered every day, and which was fairly close to what was available anyway. And then Friday night, when the issue had not yet been settled, Nixon ordered the civilian, the whole military air fleet, which had never been done. But it never was, when you say Was there a debate? Yes, these requests came in. Well, these requests were objected to, but there was never a formal confrontation.
But the part of the debate was whether to use American military aircraft or not, and I understand that you wanted to get out of the war as an honest broker, providing Israel with American airlift might cast some doubts in the Arab world about whether the United States can be an honest broker, and at the same time, when the war...
Now, but you look at this, from what happened, there was an increasing level of American supply day by day. There was never a stoppage of American supply for consideration at any point. It's while increased quantities were being discussed that there was some debate. But I bet if you analyzed how many shipments were actually held up, there wouldn't be any. I would say there would be none.
Dr. Kissinger, you started with saying something about your origin, connection to the Holocaust. Was there a moment during these days, first week, first 10 days, were you afraid that Israel will not prevail, will not win, that you as a Jew was concerned?
Yes. I didn't think Israel would collapse militarily, but I thought that Israel might get itself into a position where it gets pushed into an endless series of retreats. That I thought might happen. And there could have been a moment of panic in the early days, but that I didn't take as decisive.
And this is why I think initially you recommended Israel not to take the Egyptian proposal for a full retreat to the 47 line in return for a ceasefire.
But not during the war.
I think there was one request coming through the channel from Hafez Ismail, basically saying if Israel retreat, we will go for a ceasefire.
That you can take out of these floods of papers. The ceasefire we were supporting was an Israeli, a Dayan originated proposal on about the third or fourth day of the war, and Sadat wouldn't hear of it. We tried to get a UN resolution started for that.
Yeah, there was, at a certain stage, Israel agreed to a ceasefire in place. It was towards the 11th or the 12th of October. But then...
It was on, I don't know the date, I know the day. Yeah. It was around Thursday. Mm-hmm. And I wasn't in favor of it, actually. But we supported it.
Yes, it was a dramatic moment in Israel because Israel almost agreed to a ceasefire, and then came an intelligence message that the Egyptians are going to renew the offensive in the Sinai, and this is what we wanted them to do. So Israel decided not to go for a ceasefire. And on the 14th, that is on Sunday, I think, was the great second battle in the Sinai, where this turned the tide in the war. I'm interested personally a lot in intelligence, and I wonder, what do you think about the support that you received from the American intelligence community during this major crisis?
there were people in the intelligence community that had a different assessment from Israeli assessment. But I don't consider that a question of support or not support.
Because when I look at the Israeli decision-making process before the war and during the war, intelligence plays a huge part. I mean, it is very, very important. In the American system, I see that the intelligence is not so crucial. Is it because the quality of the intelligence is not good enough, or just because you don't need it so much?
Well, we got the daily Israeli intelligence from the Israelis. We got daily reports from our people. We took it seriously, but there's only so much time you can spend on intelligence reports. But we had daily meetings where these, in fact, there were twice daily meetings. We had the so-called Washington Special Action Group. And that's where we did most tactical discussions. And that's where it was used for information. But Nixon and I thought we were very well informed.
In retrospect, how do you see the Soviet behavior during the war? And how did that play in favor or against your goal to expel them from Egypt?
My impression of the Soviets was that at the beginning of the war, they felt an obligation to support the war. But it ran counter to what they would have preferred to be doing with the Americans. So they didn't want to lose the American relationship. So I think what happened was that they compromised. They supported their allies, but they never could muster a full-scale support. And that's true at the beginning of crises and during the conduct of crises.
And were you afraid in any moment that this could deteriorate to some sort of confrontation? Or
yes, of course.
What was that point?
Well, we thought of it, of course. The night we went on alert, that's when we thought. At the very beginning of the war, we thought there was a theoretical chance of confrontation, so we stayed in touch with the Soviets by letting them know the nature of our commitment. But the real moment occurred during the alert.
That they might be mobilizing nuclear warheads.
Well, I was concerned then. I'm concerned now about Soviet nuclear capability in these situations and the dilemma of nuclear deterrence is that you must produce a credible warning, but avoid that it triggers a preemptive attack. You have to have that always in mind. And you have to prepare yourself, because you can't invent it every time it arises anew. So the whole period we were threatening and offering.
When you raised your nuclear alert on the 24th of October, it was, of course, because of Brezhnev's note that we want to send our forces together with you, but if you don't want, we can do it, we'll have to do it by ourselves or unilaterally. And there was a high state of alert of the Soviet airborne divisions, but there were also...
They were all alerted.
Yes, yes. But there were also reports about Soviet warheads, nuclear warheads that gone through the Bosphorus to Egypt.
That's correct.
The reports were there. As far as we know today, they didn't do it.
No, we knew them.
Sorry?
We knew these reports.
And was this on the table when you decided to raise the state of alert? The nuclear
It
warheads?
was in my mind. I think yes. But we didn't do it that way. Our decisions weren't sort of a pedantic, going through individual items. The group that met then was involved in all the decisions.
I think we are getting to the end of the war and the outcome of the war.
You're also getting to the end of the
Yes.
discussion.
We are trying to be precise with that. So, Dr. Kissinger, I'm sorry for being benign. Who do you think won the October 73 war?
I think the irony may be that nobody wants it. We certainly didn't want it. Israel didn't want it. Egypt wanted it just enough to get a diplomacy started.
That's what they wanted.
Russia, yes, they started it. So they wanted a war because they thought that was the best way, the only way to get diplomacy started. I think they were wrong. I think we would have started the sort of diplomacy that led to the disengagement agreements. That was our plan. What I don't know is whether Egypt could have afforded to make such a settlement absent a military action.
Regaining their pride.
Yes.
Maybe you won, because at the end of the day, your strategy of expelling the Soviet from Egypt prevailed.
You won and we all won because we didn't have any more wars with Egypt. You know, this is the big things.
I think of it as a generally successful diplomacy.
Looking now to the future, and you know the situation in the Middle East. And from your vantage point, what do you think in the long run will best serve or can ensure Israel's security?
Serve.
Israel's security, today.
From
I can't do that at the end of an interview.
We can start all over. Oh, but maybe just...
I mean, that's a key question.
Do we go in the right way?
It's a very fluid situation in which it's possible that some things that look very favorable in one phase become less favorable or maybe even disadvantageous later, which doesn't make them wrong. It just means you have to watch them as you go through them. It's a very complicated period that's ahead, because politics that may be necessary for one limited period could become dangerous if they're pursued too long.
Yes.
Maybe I'll rephrase the last question and ask, you said something about Russia today, if I understand correctly, or Russia in relations to, are we in the middle of, you were managing the Cold War, you ended part of it. Are we in the middle of a new Cold War?
In almost all the crises around the world, there is a temptation for Cold War because it looks simple to them in retrospect.
Mm-hmm.
And because it ended well. And so you see it with Russia, you see it with China. And you see it all over the Middle East, of course. That is a very dangerous evolution.
So one final question, which relates to your academic background as well. We are, I assume, in the midst of a transformation of the world order. In the past, such transformations always involved major wars, hegemonic wars. Do you think that we are going to face a new war?
This is going to be the big debate. I think with modern technology, that has to be avoided. And that has to be the absolute acme of statesmanship to avoid. Because once you started with weapons whose extent you can't control because they partly control themselves, and for which you have no military experience, you must now manage it without war. That's never been done.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Kissinger, well, I'd like
so
to
much.
thank you very much.